So there are a few things that I was going to start with. It's kind of hard to know where to start exactly, but let's go ahead and pull out this one, the one that looks like this. And what I want you to do is I want you to see if you can see how many forms of English there are that you can count. While I eat this cookie. Any numbers yet? Any guesses? So curious what people come up with.
I'm not coming up with
10. Ooh, wow.
Don't ask me the name.
I can tell you overshot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
So then each line must be a form, right?
no.
No?
So if you look, sometimes people will say 4, 5, something like that. But if you look then at this page, it's the same text broken down into different. Yeah.
fonts.
Yeah. So the first one is from Beowulf. The first part is from Beowulf, and it's Anglo-Saxon. So it's English before a lot of French influence. So it's still a very Northern Germanic language, has a little bit more in common with Scandinavian languages. Every so often, you'll hear a word and you go, I know that word. But, it would otherwise sound probably pretty Scandinavian to your ears if you heard it, and even looks it. Then you move on to, the next thing is a quote from Chaucer. So that's Old English. That has much more in common with what we would recognize as English. You can actually make out the vast majority of the words. Some of the spellings seem a little bit odd. And from the spellings, you can tell that maybe there are even some differences of pronunciation. But that's the next section is Chaucer. Followed by, hundreds of years later, is Shakespeare. And that's a quote from Romeo and Juliet. Then you have a Southern vernacular English. After that, Southern in America, American Southern vernacular English, followed by a fairly standard news broadcaster English, present day, followed by text. That last line is just how young people are texting, right?
Wow.
Now, so as I say there at the bottom, if you don't have an English degree, and yet you can see these distinctions in the language, it's an important thing to remember that these are the kinds of things that biblical scholars see when they look at the Hebrew text, the Aramaic text, the Greek text. They see things that, and this is one of the tricky bits about the ideas that came about during the Reformation. In the Reformation, the idea was, you always go to your priest, you always go to your clergy for their expertise. But then all of a sudden you have this thing called the printing press, and everybody can have a Bible by their bedside. And then you say, well, why do I need that? I just read my Bible. You go, yeah, but once you translate it into English, or once you translate it into your native language, everything else that a person looking at the originals, a person who is trained in it, is just completely obscured, because it kind of it does the opposite of like reading as they say, reading the police in different voices. You know what I mean? Have you ever heard that like you voice different characters differently? Translation tends to obscure some things like that, and so it's tricky. On the one hand, and this has been a long standing, and is not going to be solved today, but it's a long-standing debate and dialogue between people who are specialists and this question of the democratization of information. Because on the one hand, specialists will just always have the edge on you in knowing more about it. They know more about the context of 2,000 and 3,000 years ago in the ancient Near East. They know more about all of these things. On the other hand, somebody over here who is like, maybe how do you tell the difference between a fringe specialist and a mainline specialist, and how do you know who's right? Sometimes the fringe people have been right, and sometimes the mainline is right, the consensus is right, and then sometimes somebody who's just rando, is like, I was reading my Bible and it said, I read this, what does that mean? They go, I've never really thought about that. So the democratization of information and the issue of and we saw the same thing during the pandemic. People had this, it's like, it's still going on. It's always this tricky balance between specialization and democratization of information. And people will say, well, you can't, do your research, but other people go, you're not trained enough to do research. But then you have to choose a doctor. You might get a second opinion. Whose opinion do you take? Like, this is an ongoing conversation, and we find it here in biblical scholarship as well. Now, one of the things that I mentioned, just so you have it, you can read it at your leisure, pull this one out. By looking at the language, I mentioned this in either the first or second week, by looking at the language, scholars have realized that two of probably the oldest parts of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible specifically, are actually the Song of Miriam at the Red Sea, after the Red Sea crossing, and the Song of Deborah, who was one of the judges, who will, discuss the judges a bit today. But so just so you have these and you can read these are among the oldest parts. They are attributed to women, which is interesting to know that some of the oldest long-lasting texts in the Bible are actually they're attributed to women. And one of the main reasons that they think this is sort of twofold. Number one, things that are songs are often thought to maintain their be maintained over long periods of time, because songs and song lyrics are more easily and consistently transmissible than just storytelling, which can get tweaked over time more easily. So songs tend to be thought to retain fairly well over the years. And since these are both songs, they fall into that category. And also the language. The language is sort of discernibly older. So you can read through those at your leisure. Now, so let's throw up a timeline here. Who can tell? So if we just start back, everything starts in the garden, right? At the beginning of the creation. So let's see, who do we have? We have Adam and Eve. We have the Cain and Abel episode. What follows quickly on the heels of that? Before we talked about it last week, the antediluvian patriarchs. Antediluvian meaning what? Before the deluge. Before the flood. So you got the patriarchs that lead before the flood, then you have the flood, and you have Noah. So you have this spread of people, and then you have the flood, and then after Noah you have a spread of people, and then you have a contracting of the story again back to Abraham. And so the story that follows Abraham is the story of the patriarchs. His family, that's not how you spell patriarchs. His descendants that lead through to the man that gets renamed Israel, who is Jacob. So Jacob Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, and he has many offspring. He has many offspring, and they become the heads of what are the tribes. So his, son Zebulun, the tribe of Zebulun, right? All their offspring. They go into where? During a famine in Canaan. They make their way into what country? No?
Judea.
No?
Egypt.
Egypt, yes.
Egypt.
And this is the thing that people, when you're thinking about what happens when, one of the questions, like you say, okay, we're going to talk about Moses and the Exodus today. You're like, how did they end up in Egypt in the first place? That's the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph gets sold into slavery by his annoyed brothers, and then during a famine, they all end up in Egypt, where Joseph goes, oh, hello. He's like, nice to see you boys again. And they go, oh, Joseph, we thought you were dead. And he goes, and he, there's a little back and forth, and he says, look, I love you guys. He plays a mean joke on them, and then he sets them all up. They all end up he sets them up in a land in the north of Egypt called Goshen. And so Jacob's descendants, under Joseph, end up in Egypt. Then, as Exodus starts, it says, a Pharaoh arose in Egypt who knew not Joseph. And so things start to go badly for them in Egypt. And then under Moses, they go out of Egypt. So then we have the Exodus. And that's sort of, and then while they're in the wilderness, they encounter God through Moses, this God that Moses himself has encountered. God, he gives them the law. He tells them, you are to be my people. We are going to do this. They make a covenant. And then, and because they're annoying, petulant grumblers, he keeps them in the desert for 40 years so that one generation dies off. That's the reason.
Can we do that now?
Do you get to choose who they are?
Wouldn't be very hard.
So one generation of ungrateful grumblers dies off, and their descendants are allowed to go into the land, which is where we pick up today.
Sean, did you say that in church? Sure.
Elijah will enact the ungrateful grumbling.
There you go.
You were, Josiah was here. Elijah was asking.
Everybody was
like,
thinking it.
You're grumpy. So we end up. So Moses doesn't go into the land, but he doesn't make it into the land. But they go into the land under Joshua. Joshua is Moses' successor, and this is where we start to get into this question of the people in the land, the people how they're supposed to live under this new covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the leadership thereof. And this is where you start to get into judges and the monarchy and prophets. And we'll just take a look at this page now.
There's something, you have a question over there.
Oh, yes.
But why is it called the Mosaic Law if Joshua is still the leader?
Because it was given to Moses to give to the people. So it's the Mosaic Law. Yeah. Good question.
I know, he is so great.
So anyway, Joshua is the one who ultimately leads them back into Canaan. And what we have when we get into Canaan is you have a story, at least, and we'll talk a little bit about the historicity of this. You have a story of them making their way into the land of Canaan and just lots of battles. Battle of Jericho, Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, all that. The general picture is, and a lot of people are actually, I've noticed a lot of people talking about this recently, a lot of people writing books about this, like how can you follow a God who commands genocide? The picture is actually a lot trickier than that. Number one, it's not true. That's not true. It's not a just categorical genocide of the Canaanites. In fact, huge numbers of them were expelled rather than killed. And Michael Heiser, who's a Old Testament specialist and ancient Near Eastern specialist, has observed that most of the people, this gets real weird. So remember I mentioned Enoch last week? Enochic literature, he's observed that if you look at the places where they were told, just kill them, just anybody who's even associated with that place or that place. Tons of people were expelled. They're making their way into the land. They may take over the land, but when it came to actual just kill them all, they were almost without fail an area associated with giants. Remember the spies go into the land and they're huge. We're like ants to them. And then that's what they report back to Moses. This goes back to a thing in Genesis 6. Do you know the reason for the flood? It's messed up. This is messed up. And nobody talks about this.
Everyone was sinning.
Kind of, yes. That is a big, big part of it. But at the very beginning of Genesis 6, who do we encounter, Elijah?
Before the flood.
The Genesis 6, just before the flood, who do we encounter? The sons of God and the daughters of men.
When he
The
says
Nephilim.
The Nephilim.
yeah.
In Genesis 6, it says, the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men. And this term, although some people have different takes on it, generally speaking, this term means like spiritual beings. The sons of God looked upon the daughters of men and took them as wives, and their offspring were called the Nephilim, and they were giants. Now, on the one hand, you could be like, well, this is weird little bit of mythology, but it is interesting that there is this kind of shared Mediterranean legacy of these kind of demigod people, these things like that. In fact, a person that we can reasonably be inclined to believe existed is Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, if you heard about that in literature growing up, it's one of the oldest stories we have. It comes from Mesopotamia.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is considered to be 2/3 God, 2/3 deity, divine, and 1/3 human.
I
Gilgamesh
was
is.
thinking that was Indian.
Oh yeah, no, it's Mesopotamian. It's a little further west. But what's interesting is that Gilgamesh shows up in a king's list in other areas, like the list of like kings that we have no strong reason to doubt that this is a real list. So Gilgamesh is just this side of likely to be a historical character. But the stories about him are that he was something like a demigod. And you obviously have Hercules and all these other sort of stories from Greece and things like that. But he was also considered to be giant in stature. Og of Bashan in the Bible is considered to be giant in stature. He has a massive bed. Almost all the places that are associated with genocide in the capture of Canaan are specifically areas associated with giants. And this association persists in terms of like, we're talking about like the fan fiction of Second Temple literature. The idea was that this sort of crossbreeding and the offspring, that it was generally felt that like part of the reason for the flood is that these beings were teaching warfare, were teaching, metallurgy to make weapons, teaching all sorts of things that were leading man astray. And so the idea was these people, these giants and anybody who supports them, they're done. Their bloodline stops. We don't want any more of this. In fact, a famous one was they start to be called the Rephaim or the Anakim, based on tribes of giants. And a famous Anakite was Goliath, right? So it's a very interesting it's a very interesting little bit of lore that a lot of people don't really talk about. And you're not going to hear your pastor stand up and let's talk about the giants, everybody. And he goes, "Did I just enter a Dungeons and Dragons game?
Yeah.
What's going on here?" But
In the mythology all around that area,
Mhm.
you mentioned it. We know like Greek mythology with the gods and humans, and if you think about when you're telling a victory story, these people were huge.
Right.
There's always an embellishment of the storytelling.
yeah,
And it has a point. We fought, it was a hard fought battle, and it was against a foe that was formidable.
Yeah.
So
So
why
it's-
wouldn't our stories be like that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting, like, and putting the pieces together and understanding why things happen. So like this picture of just, well, these perfectly normal, Hebrews made their way into perfectly normal land inhabited by perfectly normal people and decided to just murder them all. That's, on the one hand, there are certainly things about it and about the story that we can take exception to or say this is no good or that's no good or whatever.
One more
And
thing I'm going to say about that: a lot of times when there's violence ordered, the voice of God is silent. You
that's
don't
another good
often
point too.
say, God said, do this.
Right.
It's a human being who said, we will do
Right.
this.
And these are things you can totally see. You're like, well, God wants us in the land. You go, well, there are all these people here, so God must want us to kill them. Like, well, that's not necessarily what God, right? So you have to distinguish between that too. That's another big one. But so on the one hand, yes, and especially as there are echoes of this with our Native American populations here, these are things that, the average, moral person should really look at with scrutiny. On the other hand, it's important that when people say, well, you just genocide, kill the people, that's not actually true. Looking at what it actually says matters before you assess what was really going on and the morality of it. But also the historical picture is not really supportive of that either. It turns out that the archaeological record demonstrates that the development of Israel as a nation was much messier and more variable than this. But in the same way, and we have to remember this when we look at it, in the same way that, like, I'll say to Elijah maybe that, well, our ancestors this, and what I mean is Sarah's side. So in fact, it doesn't apply to me at all, right? And then, so we do tell these stories about ourselves that maybe once upon a time were a little bit more disparate, but as you coalesce into a people, you start to say, well, we, right? And so there are certain things that we're seeing about the development of Israel as a tribe where they say this happened to the people. What it means is probably it happened to one part of the people, and I'll come back to that as a point in a bit. But once they enter the land, so they go in and they capture Canaan through a variety of means. Sometimes it's expulsion of people, sometimes they don't completely expel them, sometimes they do conquer them. And when they get there, they put out allotments of land to the 12 tribes, and they then are ruled by judges who sort of they fulfill this function of both kind of speaking for God and also being the kind of political and military leadership, right? One of the interesting things about this, though, is that if you probably don't have, but let's say you have 12, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 tribes, 12 male children of the 13 that Jacob had. Well, the Levites don't get any land. Well, so that's only 11 tribes. But we know there are 12 tribes in Israel. So now we have 11. But Joseph was really prominent. Joseph saved them when they went into Egypt. So Joseph, in the name of his two sons, gets Joseph's. So Joseph's under. I'm gonna run another ink on this. Joseph's allotment.
You need to get some more of those
More,
pins, huh?
Joseph's allotment. Joseph's allotment goes to his two sons, and the other one gets Levi's. Joseph, his son Manasseh, and the other one is Ephraim. They take up Joseph's and Levi's tribe. So we're back to 12. But the reason Levites don't get a tribe is because the Levites are to serve as priests. So they live dispersed among the tribes. And this is a really interesting and important point about, because it's a microcosm of what Israel is supposed to be. So Israel has a priestly class. For the peoples of the nation, Israel is supposed to be a priestly class, right? And this is an interesting point that we'll see when we get to Jesus' ministry, because Jesus we all, it very quickly makes its way into the Gentile world. But Jesus' ministry is very directly to his fellow Jewish people, saying, are we doing this? Are we fulfilling our role? Are we living as we ought to as a priestly people, as a people of God? And so anyway, Levites serve a priestly function and live in and among all of the tribes. Israel as a group had a lot of volatile neighbors. Philistia, we talk about the Philistines, they were one of a group of people called the Sea Peoples, who were really present during what's called the Bronze Age collapse. And they just took over a lot of territory, and they were constantly present on the coast of Israel and were sort of a persistent problem for Israel. They, as a result, eventually get tired after a series of judges. They get tired of living tribally and always having to congregate to fight off enemies. They say, why don't we just be a whole nation and let's have a king like everybody else? And God says, no. But then finally he relents because they keep bellyaching, and he says, all right, well, you can have a king. And he has Samuel, who is the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. So the series of the time of the judges is followed by the time of the prophets. The job changes. And what you have is a kind of a splitting of the duties. The judges fulfill, as I said, this function of working with the law and speaking for God and acting on behalf of God, and also administratively and militarily. But then that splits into the monarchy doing the administrative and military leadership, and the prophets speaking for God, being kind of the conscience for the nation. And so the last judge, as I said, is Samuel, and he anoints Saul king. And Samuel is then the first of the prophets. And then that's the institution of the monarchy. But they only had 3 kings of a united Israel. And do you remember who they were?
Saul, David, and Solomon.
Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul's the first one. He falls out of favor. God chooses David next. And Samuel anoints David king. And then Solomon follows in David's footsteps. Solomon is David's son. Solomon builds the temple. David transfers the center of worship from, was it Shiloh at that point? I can't remember whether it was Shiloh or Gerizim, but it was either Gerizim or Shiloh. He transfers the center of worship, taking the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and everything into Jerusalem and setting up everything there. And Jerusalem becomes the capital. And then that begins, the next thing is the beginning of the prophetic tradition, sort of in earnest. You have Nathan calling David to account for his behavior with Bathsheba, right? So you've got somebody, being the conscience while David is doing his
What's the
craziness.
famous line?
Thou art the man.
Thou art the man. So they build under a united kingdom under the last of the 3, Solomon's temple. That's the first temple. And then after Solomon, this question of who's supposed to be in charge, because there's a whole lot of friction in David's descendants, in his family, in his sons and all of that. There's a lot of friction. And the kingdom divides. It just splits over rulership questions. And what you have is a division between the north and the south. And because the north had 10 tribes, it had the majority of the tribes, they retained the name Israel. And in the south, because Judah was the largest of the tribes, it just absorbed Benjamin and it was called Judah or Judea. And this remained the case for the rest of the time. Certainly up until and past Jesus' era. But then you have 2 things that happen. One happens to the north, and then the same thing happens to the south. Assyria becomes a growing power in the region, and it obliterates the northern kingdom and deports tons of the population. A ton of them. And they're called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And one of the things that happens in this, when Israel became its own kingdom, they had Samaria. They made Samaria their capital. When the Assyrians deported tons of people from the north, the general feeling was that we can't a bunch of people fled south into Judah. Israelites fled south into Judah, and then a bunch of people were deported. And the general feeling in the south was that we can't trust that anybody up there is in any way related to us anymore. They are just a lost cause. And the Samaritans, particularly in the capital, Samaritans who retained worship, who maintained and retained worship and claimed to be remnant Israelites, were there, stuck around, and even today have been genetically tested and are related to Jewish people. They still exist today, and they still live on Mount Gerizim. We talked about this last week a bit, but this remains a point of serious contention for centuries and centuries, well into Jesus' day, and they maintain that they are absolutely remnant Israelites, and the people, the Jews, as they'll say, there's that, we talked about the scene at Jacob's well with the Samaritan woman, and she goes, and you, a Jew, do this, whatever, and Jesus treats her like, no, you're part of this story too. And remember, I said that it's interesting that Jesus's ministry is not to a bunch of Gentiles, but is out to his fellow Jewish people. He spends a lot of time with Samaritans.
He wants to unite them.
Yeah, because he's very interested in unity among them. But later on, Judah is subject to similar treatment by Babylon. So Assyria conquers the north. Babylon sort of takes over Assyria's mantle in the region. Babylon then deports a bunch of prominent Judeans, not nearly as wholesale as in the north. They kind of take the prominent figures only. They take them into Babylon, where you get this really, this huge strengthening of their identity as Jews. In fact, before the Babylonian exile, to call these people Jews as such is a sort of a misnomer. It's a misnomer, unless you really mean specifically from the tribe of Judah. But after the fact, neighboring peoples and everything will frequently just call any of these people Jews. But then Persia allows them to return. So you see, after Babylonian captivity, they return under Persian rule, after the Persians defeat the Babylonians, and that they rebuild a new temple, and that starts what we call Second Temple Judaism. It closes out the Hebrew Bible. There is no more canonical text in the Hebrew Bible of Second Temple Judaism. But Second Temple Judaism is where you get things like the Maccabees and the Hanukkah story, and a lot of other things that we didn't really know a ton about, but were really important to Second Temple Jews like Jesus and the disciples. And one thing I should actually say, to make a correction from either last week or the week before, I said that the Septuagint, the Greek form of the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was the one that was probably most known by Jesus and his disciples. I heard somebody else make a comment to the effect that that's not necessarily the case. And what I should say is a couple of things. One is that it was really, really common for diaspora Jews at the time, people who were living in Hellenized territories, but not necessarily in Galilee or in Judah at the time. So it was the most prominent, most common one known by diaspora Jews at the time, and it was the one that was most commonly used by the authors of the New Testament, which are only a little removed from Jesus and the disciples themselves. But still, the people in the land, the Galileans, probably knew the Hebrew Bible better. However, one really interesting thing is that the most common form of the Hebrew Bible today was put together by scholars in the, I don't know what centuries it is, but it's in the centuries AD. It may even have been closer to 1000 AD. But it was put together by a bunch of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes. And so what the text that they came up with, the canonical text they came up with, is called the Masoretic text. It's the one most commonly used, and it is sort of established and has been used for forever now. But what's interesting is that if you look at when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found huge chunks of the Hebrew Bible. And in many cases where there are differences between the Septuagint, which is really a very old translation, when we find differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls, I can't acronym today. The Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls texts of the Hebrew Bible, where these two are different, these tend to agree with the Septuagint. So so even if the language is not necessarily the one that they would have been reading, the versions, including small variants, would still probably be closer to the Septuagint, even for Jesus and his disciples, if not in actual Greek. But, so anyway, that's, the division of the consolidation of the kingdom and then the division of the kingdom is a huge factor in why the Hebrew prophets arose, because in many cases the prophets said, do you know why Assyria came in and kicked our butts? Because we're not following the law and God has removed his protection. Oh, do you know why Babylon kicked our butts? Because we're not following the law and God removed his protection. And then this gradual return and the rebuilding of the Second Temple, but this sort of fear of what happens to us as a nation when we aren't following the law. It's just happened to us twice. Could it happen again? Rome, right? This is all very much in the water when Jesus and the disciples and all of these other sort of Second Temple sects start to come up. And so it's a very interesting time. Messiahs were sort of like, people were on the lookout for messiahs big time in the era around Jesus' time. And they weren't wrong, because about 40 years after Jesus, Rome destroys Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that more when we get to that. But yeah, so it's a very interesting time. The whole question of the ethical observations of the prophets is, what kind of a people are we being? Are we being the kind of people we're supposed to be? Are we doing what we're supposed to do? Or are we just another civilization, another city, another whatever, all kind of looking out for ourselves, being Babylon? And places like Babylon and Rome became bywords for standard corrupt political entities, right?
Did you already talk about how these people were, they were like unique among the area because they actually had a code that brought them together, a law that was like early on, probably.
Well, it's true. I mean, certainly like the Code of Hammurabi and things like that are special because they're rarities. Yeah,
the laws is what unified them.
Yeah, but the thing that's really kind of interesting about the law is that before the Babylonian exile, before the destruction of the northern kingdom and the Babylonian exile for the south, there's a whole lot. It's just story after story of people kind of not following the Yahwistic cult, not following the Mosaic law, not keeping with it. It's just, they get drawn away by Jezebel and Ahab in the northern kingdom, King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. They're constantly swayed left and right away from the thing they're supposed to be doing. That's a big part of what the prophets are saying. But then, after the Assyrian destruction of the north, and then after the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first temple, when they go away to Babylon, you get all of these stories and songs of return and hope, longing for home, and stories of like, oh, I wish this strong identity of being Jewish starting to build and going, don't follow your gods. We're Jewish. We follow our God and whatever stuff that when they were in the land, didn't care, right? But this strong sentiment. And then when you get back, Second Temple Judaism starts to become sectarian not because they're looking to follow other gods, but because now they're competing to see who's following God right. You get You get all of the sects. You get the Pharisees, you get the Sadducees, you get the Essenes, you get different groups that gradually come to be known as sort of political religious fighters that are now known to us as
What was the guy? What was Judah? What was Judas?
it's I'm thinking the Sicarii, but they're zealots.
Yeah.
As zealots, and that's not accounting for other groups that were kind of in conversation with them, like Egyptian Judaism, Philo of Alexandria, people like that. There's a little bit of back and forth, but generally speaking, in the land you have, and then you have groups that are in charge of different parts of the temple life, and they have their, and then of course the Samaritans themselves are part of this. And so this kind of sectarian Judaism that's going, you're doing it wrong, you're following the wrong calendar, and we know when to celebrate this thing, and you guys, you're not supposed to be doing that, you should be doing that. People would not go to the bathroom on Saturdays, and if they did go to the bathroom in certain quadrants of Jerusalem, they would go outside the city wall, not just have a spot in their, near their home or whatever. Things that, how observant can I be? How observant can I be? How, it's, some of them taking it very, and Baptists wouldn't quite, they probably had some relation, good chance, with the Essenes, but that's a whole movement. And they still exist today, Manichaeans. Mandeans. Anyway, they're Baptists, and they actually, they actually follow. They count. I think there's some in Iran and maybe India, but it's this sectarian Judaism in Second Temple. In Second Temple Judaism is that's the sort of fertile ground where we find. I think it's Mandean.
Manichaean came later.
Yeah, it's more Gnostic, I think. Yeah. But yeah, they it all. And it all this is the fertile ground that we find Jesus coming up in, and it's very everything that he had to say, and it's very interesting stuff. But so, are there any questions? I think that was.
The Oxford Study Bible there. If you ever grab one when you're in here, if there's a reference to something historically at the introductions of each book or each testament. There's a lot of great historical things that, Brad's already talking about, little details and stuff. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. Any questions? I know that there's a lot to today's thing, but
I do have 2 questions.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the northern name for God or the southern name for God that you have on here.
Yeah.
Well, I never heard that before or read that.
This is one of the ways that people have, and it's not hard and fast, but some people have wondered if that is another example of in the writing that this section seems to use the word El, and this section seems to use the word Yahweh or Yahoo, and they think maybe that's a sign of 2 different authors here. But in any event, the reason that happens is because in the north. And we know about this from them finding, so if you take Canaan, you have the map. If you take Canaan, in the north, the Canaan land of Phoenicia, and a little bit north of that, I believe, is a place called Ugarit. And Ugarit is a northern Canaanite region, and they had a very, we have found texts from Ugarit, the Ugaritic texts. We found texts that have their mythologies laid out, these Canaanite mythologies. Excuse me. And what you find is that their head god is called El, and there are terms for him: El Elyon, which means Most High God. El Shaddai. These are terms that make their way into the Hebrew Bible for God, and El just means God. You'll see that in a lot of angel names: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, all of these. And the term El, it's even in Israel, right? Struggles with God, Israel. Now, in northern Saudi Arabia, and this is funky, this is really interesting. do you still have the pages with the patriarchs and their families? I'll show you here. I've got it here.
You have to post those on the bulletin board.
But when Moses goes, yeah, here we go.
It's interesting. People don't talk about this much, but after Sarah dies, he remarries a woman named Keturah. And what's interesting is that when Moses flees Egypt, he kills a man and has to run and flee Egypt. What's interesting is that he flees into an area called Midian. Midian is known to be in northwestern Saudi Arabia. He flees into this region and encounters God on a mountain. And his father-in-law is a priest. Jethro is a priest of Midian. And he encounters God in the burning bush in that whole episode on this mountain in Midian. And what's interesting is that Moses doesn't meet God. He doesn't meet the God of Abraham. He doesn't meet the God of his forefathers in and among his own people. He doesn't meet him in Egypt, in Goshen, when he experiences family or talks with his brother Aaron or anything. He meets him in Midian, the God of Abraham, the God of Israel in Midian. Look at the names under Abraham and Keturah's offspring. Do you have it?
No, I don't have that sheet. I might have missed that day.
Midian.
We'll have to get copies.
Yeah.
Moses meets the God of Abraham in Midian, which I always think is a very, very interesting thing. And then that's where he brings the people.
Because he didn't really know that God as much,
Yeah.
because he was raised in the Egyptian culture.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is that they come out of Egypt and they go to Midian. And Midian has this desert storm god of the mountains called Yahweh, right? And now there are very old references to tribes and groups of people. There's one called the Shasu, who were thought to be bands of Semitic brigands, but they're called the Shasu of Yahoo. So it's almost certainly similar. So these are, anyway, but so they come out to Midian, to this mountain, and then they, make their way north. So it's generally thought that in the north, they've got this tradition, and there's this most high God of their pantheon. And in the south, they've got this Yahweh figure, and that what happens when they come into the land is that the recognition, it's sort of like when Paul in the Areopagus, Paul is, he goes to the Areopagus, I can't remember where it is. Is it in Rome? It's not in Rome, it's in Greece.
No.
Sorry, it's clearly not in Rome.
I don't know,
But is it Athens? I can't remember.
Could
Anyway,
be.
he goes and he's going to preach about Jesus and all this
Yeah.
stuff. But first, he sees up, and you've got all these figurines and gods and everything of the Greek pantheon up in these fixed spots, and one of them is empty, and it's reserved for the unknown God. And he says, "You already know our God. It's that one, the one that you don't know, that you still acknowledge exists. That's our God." And as it happens, he's the most important. He's the big cheese. In the same way, this movement into the land, the recognition that El Elyon is this most high God, it becomes an equation. They equate the two. And this gets back, remember I was saying something about the historicity of it. What the archaeology is starting to show is that the sheer numbers that we're told of Hebrews leaving Egypt is just almost certainly not realistic and impossible. They're like, that many people, you're talking about probably 1 million people or so. It's just like, there's no way they wouldn't leave a trace. However, it is known that groups of Semitic peoples were either ejected or left Egypt at various points in Egypt's past. And somebody made an observation, Richard Elliott Friedman, who's a scholar of this. There's generally a picture, if you look at ancient Hebrew, if you go back far enough, it is indiscernibly, it's not, there's no difference between that and ancient Canaanite, ancient Phoenician. And the general picture is that during the Bronze Age collapse, as a bunch of people were kind of just, these cultures were just kind of suffering and falling apart, an underclass of Canaanites kind of moved out into the highlands and began to live out kind of just sort of a little bit more pastorally and things like that. And it's the picture that's kind of emerging is that in tribal groups, some mixture of Canaanite underclass tribes and then possibly some Semitic peoples that came out of Egypt, possibly bringing with them this Yahweh, gradually all encountered each other in this area and started to kind of form a federation and become a people. So that instead of all of them coming out into a land of Canaanites, what you have is Canaanite peoples with their god, their high god, El Elyon, other people coming in, them all forming a federation and gradually coalescing into being one people that they called Israel. And Israel as a concept, as a people, does go back quite early, because there are, I can't remember if it's Hittite or if it was Egyptian, but fairly early on, there's a reference to them, like to somebody defeating Israel in battle. So we know that pretty early they formed this identity as people. But we get Hebrew not from this wandering group of Hebrews over here who just had this language. We get Hebrew because that's just the language of this region that gradually distinguishes itself from Canaanite. It becomes its own thing. You get the importing, and still, even in the stories, they're still drawn back to these other gods, drawn back, because the son of El Elyon is, guess who?
Wow.
Yeah, that the sort of bull, and so these, and then you see this fight. I mean, the Elijah story is him against the priests of Baal, and so anyway, so this kind of coalescing of this identity into a people, and then eventually into a monarchy to which they're all subject, is a sort of a more gradual process. But Richard Elliott Friedman, I started to say, one thing that he observes is that the Levites, if you look at the Levites among all these tribes, the Levites all have Egyptian names. So he's like, I can believe some came out of Egypt. I think maybe the Levites were a religious group, and they became the dominant religious group of the region, and they sort of served this priestly function. You've got this group that came out of Egypt. You got this group that was still there. You've got, it's and in many respects, it may have been a sort of underdog, underclass, collection of people who all kind of come together to form something greater than the sum of its parts, So it's very interesting. It's hard to say, well, it's in the Bible, so it happened. We're like, well, just because, you say, well, archaeology shows us that it didn't happen. Well, that's not really true either. It's very possible. A lot of what we find in the Old Testament is something that could be called propaganda, right? There's a ton of evidence that when they split, and by the time the things are starting to be written down during the Babylonian period, clear preference is given to Judah and to Judean hopes and dreams. Like David is clearly like a Judean figurehead, as opposed to, they're like, whatever interest the North has, they're involved, they're included, but Judah is given preference. David is given preference over Saul. Judah is given preference over Israel. These things, and there's a lot of kind of justifying of things. There's a lot of trying to, So, what was the other question?
My other question is the text today, the text that kids use today.
Mm-hmm.
I can read K, thanks, lot of love, lot of love. But that L8R, I have no
Later.
idea.
Later.
Oh, thank you.
Later,
Later.
kind of like
Yeah.
IDK.
I tried to break kids of the habit when they try to hand in paper with that.
Right.
One
So-
thing to remember with all this wonderful historical and archaeological stuff is the text that we end up with is a story about relationship.
Yeah, it's a story. It's basically the story. The Hebrew canon is the story of how they came to be. That's their kind of, in some cases, whitewashed, in some cases whatever. But it's their story, and it's this, and more importantly, it's the story of Jesus. One of the things that I always ask the confirmands is, you say you believe in God. Okay, great. Who you believe in? The God of Jesus? Okay, well, so who's Jesus' God? Well, that's the God of Moses. Okay, so who's Moses' God? That's the God of
Whoa.
Abraham, right? These things, and then you look at the God that they believed in, or the covenants that they had with that God. This is, one of the things that I think is worth asking. There's that line from "Read the books your father read," right? What kind of stories were in Jesus' head? One of the things that I think James Tabor has made a really, really good case for this is that, particularly for the Galileans, maybe, but certainly he thinks for Jesus at least in particular, and some of his, the people that he was interested in and followed and led, that the stories of the Maccabees were really fresh. Because there are lines in 4th Maccabees that say about the martyrs, the Maccabean martyrs, that they died for the sins of the people.
And the book of Maccabees is in that Oxford Bible over there if you ever want to look.
Yeah, so what would that have meant to Jesus?
And the parable today isn't unique to Christianity, or it's not unique to the culture that we were talking about. That actually came from lots of different places.
Yeah, I think there's a Japanese variant of it too,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken.
So it was a story that was in there, and they, probably already knew the story.
Mhm.
But Jesus would make a different application of it.
Yeah, but so I mean, if we're talking about the things that animate people, they always say that Americans, by contrast with other countries, have very short memories because our history is so short. Whereas people in China are like, well, it was only 400 years ago that they did that horrible thing.
Yeah.
We still need retribution. You know what I mean?
History, especially with tearing down all the statues, I have a problem with that.
Yeah. Well, there's. I
Well,
mean,
when we were in Germany, the new church in a little town called Gambrikheim was 400 years old.
Yeah.
Oh,
The new building.
Yeah.
right.
So it's it's knowing kind of what animated folks, what kind of stuff was on their minds, what kind of thoughts, how is this hundreds of years old animus between Galileans and Judeans and the Samaritan people? How does that, I mean, we listen to the Samaritan thing, the story of the Good Samaritan, and we think, well, it's just a story about which one of these guys did the nice thing. It's not that at all. Jesus says this and gets in a lot of trouble for it, because he says, you look at the people that he says, a priest, and then is it a Levite? A priest and a Levite both pass by their fellow Jew who's hurt, and they do nothing. They're like, no, and then who does the right thing? A Samaritan. And what Jesus is saying is that you guys think you're so special. This righteousness is not reserved to you merely by being Jewish or by being a Levite or by being a priest. This Samaritan can be way higher on God's thumbs up list than you, by kind of a lot, merely by showing kindness and love to this other person. And then he tells a smaller version of this to children when he says a father says, go out and do this. And the first son says, okay, but then doesn't do it.
Yeah.
The next son says, no, I won't, but then he goes and does it. And he says, which of these sons did his father's will? And the kids go, the second one. And then Jesus gives some serious side eye to the priests, and everybody's they get it. It's really, this is the stuff that informs Jesus's ministry. And it makes a huge dent knowing exactly what he's getting at. so that we understand it better. And so knowing some of this history and knowing some of what, like I said, what was on their minds is hugely informative.
And it's
For it.
important, especially it's contemporary, because there is a rise called of Christian nationalism.
That's, yeah.
There's a group of so-called Christians who do not believe that Jesus was here to tell that story, that whoever does God's will of kindness, because they have a completely different idea of this stories and this history that we believe in, and we need to be mindful of that.
And by that same token, we have a lot of people who are like really devoted secularists who are walking around with, Judeo-Christian values that they think are self-evident. They're like, but they're happy to sort of go, we don't need God, we just need to be good. You're like, what is good? What are you even talking about?
Yeah.
And
Goes
like,
back to your original question.
yeah.
Of
And
the critique. Well, how do you know?
yeah, and you can totally say, well, we don't need God, or we don't need this religion to be good. But the problem is that if you were born in India, your idea of good might be heavily influenced by a caste system that you just take as for granted. You might, in Japan, if you have certain, for years, if you had certain jobs, like being a mortician, you were considered untouchable. Somebody had to do it, but the price you pay for consistent work is that you're people kind of leave you alone. You deal with dead bodies. That's no, right? But over here we might be like, that's totally wrong, and they'd be like, says you,
Yeah.
right? So this question of what's called epistemics and just knowing why you think what you think, where you get it, and I mean, there's no way. People say that the West was born between Athens and Jerusalem. And so either saying, well, the Bible says it, so that's why it is. And then,
Somebody says
or we
time.
say, well, what's self-evident is so,
Hint, hint.
this is why the dialogue and study is so important.
Brad, you are so knowledgeable.